Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the EU debate. There's a small matter of a little referendum coming up at the end of the month, and we've got some speakers here today. They're each going to do 5 minutes, and then we'll go to a question and answer session. Well, where shall we start? That end or this end? Who wants to go first?
You start on the right or the left?
Let's start on the left.
It's all a matter of perspective. For there, you're on the right.
Let's start with my left then. If everyone can introduce themselves and just give your 5-minute speech
Okay.
on where you stand, please.
Okay, thanks for the introduction. My name is Derek Foran. I'm the Labour MEP for Wales. And I want to say, first of all, to the organisers, thank you for organising the event. I'm actually a Merthyr boy. I've just come from Aberfan, where I visited my mother. So I know about the proud heritage and history, particularly the radical heritage of Merthyr, and I'm very proud of that, as I said. And what I want to do in my 4 or 5 minutes is just give the progressive case for membership of the European Union. And the first thing I want to talk about was jobs. And I think the importance of jobs has been recognised by the TUC and all the major trade unions. And indeed, over the last week or so, we've had various analyses come out of the TUC to say if we left the European Union, there would be an economic shock, there would be a reduction in our GDP, there'd be less jobs, there'd be lower pay, and there'd be less tax revenue going into the Treasury, which of course means there's less money to fund our public services, health, education, and so on. Recently as well, we've seen individual companies come out and warn about the dangers of leaving the EU. So, for example, recently Ford's and Airbus, who are massive employers in Wales, have written to all their employees to warn them of the dangers. In addition to those economic arguments, of course, Wales sees huge benefit from the EU due to the funding we receive. When I drove into Merthyr earlier, I just saw loads and loads of EU plaques and flags. It seems to me half of Merthyr has been funded by the European Union. We know Wales is a net beneficiary of EU funds, and we know places like Merthyr in particular are huge beneficiaries. We know the square just down the road, the Penderyn Square and the Red House, been funded by the European Union. We know the Edge of the Valley Road received £82 million of EU funds to do it, and we know Merthyr Football Club has received a large amount of money, and I'm very pleased to say that because Merthyr was one of my former clubs. I played for them many years ago, so I'm delighted to see Merthyr Football Club have had some funding as well. In addition to those funding, of course, we know the EU gives us many, many rights, consumer rights, environment rights, but importantly for me, workers' rights as well. Many of our workers' rights come from the European Union, and one of the dangers is if we leave the European Union, we in the UK will be left with a far-right government, including Gove, IDS and Boris, and we know what they're going to do with workers' rights. They will take the first opportunity to scrap those workers' rights. So for me, it's absolutely vital we remain part of the European Union to make sure we retain those rights. I know some colleagues will have issues with the European Union. TTIP will be one of them. But I say to colleagues and comrades, the final decision on TTIP, this free trade agreement between the EU and the US, will be taken by the European Parliament, by people like Jill and myself. And we have our red lines. We will not vote for a TTIP if it includes public services, if it includes the National Health Service. We will not vote for TTIP if it undermines protection for our environment, for our food safety standards and for workers' rights. And we will not vote for a TTIP which includes ISDS, the so-called secret court. It's probably a number of years away before we vote on it, but in Europe, we have a chance to change TTIP and reject it. If we're not in Europe, you'll get a TTIP, we'll have a TTIP, and it'll be negotiated by a right-wing Tory government and the US. They won't care a jot about the NHS, about public services, about protecting workers' rights or ISDS. They are more supportive than anybody else in Europe. So we'll get one, but it won't be one we want. At least in the EU, we have a chance to stop that. And my final point, in my 4 or 5 minutes, is probably up on this. I say to colleagues and comrades, there's nothing left-wing or progressive about putting at risk tens of thousands of Welsh workers' jobs. There's nothing left-wing or progressive about putting at risk the rights of Welsh workers. And there's nothing left-wing or progressive about giving a huge victory to the far-right nationalists across Europe, because they are the biggest supporters of Brexit. They want to go back to the days of member states. And then that takes us into all sorts of problems about securing the peace and stability in Europe. So I say to colleagues, in conclusion, it's absolutely vital we vote to stay in, to protect our jobs, to protect our rights, and to make sure we retain peace and stability in the European Union.
Jill, if you can go with, please.
Thanks. My name is Jill Evans. I'm also an MEP, a member of the European Parliament for Wales. Like Derek, we're colleagues in the Parliament. I'm from the Rhondda. I live in the Rhondda. I always have. And I believe that Wales is culturally, socially, economically and environmentally better off in Europe. I strongly believe, passionately believe, in Wales staying in the EU because I don't see a successful future for us as a small nation outside it, certainly not within Britain, because Derek talked about the funding, and of course European funding is important, but I think what that reflects is firstly the reason why areas like Merthyr and the Rhondda and the whole of West Wales and the valleys get so much European funding is because of policies of successive Westminster governments. Our areas produced so much wealth, and all that wealth was taken out, and that money was never invested in these communities by a London government. But the EU has a policy of solidarity. The EU regional policy is aimed at bringing the poorest areas up to a level with the richer areas across Europe. And they've demonstrated that solidarity towards us in Wales. Now, we all want to get to a position where we are not receiving any European funding anymore. And then I hope we can show that same solidarity to other countries and other regions which have been in the same position. And people say, well, it's our money. Of course it's our money, but the money in Westminster is our money too. And all of my political life, I have fought to get fair funding for Wales and for our communities, and we've never got it from Westminster. Now, European funding, of course, isn't the only answer. It's going to help us overcome the problems. But to do that, we have to have more powers in Wales. We have to have a government in Wales that's really able to act to transform our economy. We are not going to get that if we are outside the EU. There are other issues like social Europe, workers' rights. I was on the Employment Committee for many years working on things like the Working Time Directive. And we were always coming up against the UK government, blocking things, wanting to opt out of things, so that our workers here in Wales had worse conditions than in the rest of Europe, and I've seen that myself. On climate change, I've seen the EU leading in the talks in Paris last year to get that historic breakthrough agreement, which wouldn't have been achieved if the EU hadn't been able to bring all the countries together, the European countries, to negotiate with the poorest countries and come to an agreement. And on TTIP, which I've been campaigning very hard against, the only way of us defeating TTIP is by working with a growing movement against it across Europe. And it's growing really, really fast. If we come out, as Derek said, we'll have some kind of agreement with the United States, and it'll certainly be a lot worse. Now, I want to change a lot of things in Europe. I've worked in the Parliament since 1999 trying to change things, and it changes all the time. The EU is not static. It responds and it adapts to changing circumstances. So we can change it. I know people say it's impossible. It's not. We've seen it ourselves, what we can do. And on TTIP, we saw a mass movement of people actually push the European Parliament to call off, to postpone a vote on TTIP because the lobbying from people across Europe was so massive. So we can do it. And we can work with other progressive organisations and parties across the rest of the European Union to build the kind of Europe that we want, but certainly from my point of view, a successful Wales is going to be a member of the European Union. We can't do it outside.
Yes, my name's Rob Griffiths. I'm General Secretary of the Communist Party, but perhaps more relevant to today, I'm also chair of Lexit, the Left Leave campaign, which brings together a coalition of left-wing, migrant worker and trade union organisations against the European Union, because we understand it is now what it has always been. It's a big business club. It's fundamentally anti-democratic, and it's not in the interests of working class people and never has been. And I'd love to hear the response to some of these pro-EU speeches to an audience of workers in Greece or Portugal or Cyprus or any of the other countries where they've had EU and IMF austerity and privatisation programmes forced upon them. The EU has destroyed millions of jobs through these programmes. And pointing to the odd sign here and there about how something is funded by the EU, as if the EU actually funds anything, is no compensation for the reality. I've just come back from the French Communist Party Congress in Paris. I've met representatives of workers' organisations, the Belgian Labour Party, the Portuguese Communist Party, the biggest left-wing party in Cyprus. I've met representatives of the CGT Federation and so on. They don't believe any of this nonsense that somehow the EU is the friend of working class people and their organisations, or that there's something narrow or nationalistic about opposing the EU. There are the right-wing arguments against the EU, that's true, but there are many on the left who have woken up to the reality of the EU in recent years. Something has been made already about the EU as the defender of workers' rights. It wasn't the EU that gave us the right to join a trade union, or the right to strike, or the right to ballot for collective bargaining, or a national minimum wage, or maternity rights that are 5 times better than those supposedly guaranteed by the European Union. It was us. It was our unions. It was past Labour governments. Why are we rubbishing the record of our own movement to pretend that somehow the EU has given us this? Workers' rights are under attack all over Europe, including in Britain. In France, there are mass strikes against the attempts to abolish the 35-hour week. There's a similar law going through the parliament in Italy. There's a similar law going through the parliament in Belgium. Who's defending workers against those attacks? The EU isn't lifting a finger. It's never lifted a finger to defend us against any of the 11 or 12 anti-trade union laws we've had in Britain since 1980. The only people defending us are ourselves and the solidarity we get from other working class organisations. And let me just say this thing about Wales and the money we supposedly get from the bountiful EU. The EU doesn't have any money. The EU is recycling the contribution that they get from Britain. That's the reality. And Britain this year, according to the Office of Budget Responsibility, is going to make a net contribution of £15.2 billion. Wales, according to calculations that can never be accurate because we can't be absolutely sure how much taxation is actually generated in Wales, but by some accounts, Wales is a net beneficiary as far as the EU funding is concerned, to the tune of £18 million this year. Plaid Cymru get the total somehow nearer to 92 million. Let them argue it out. Either way, that is less than 1/5 of 1% of Britain's net contribution to the EU budget. In other words, if that contribution came to an end next year, all we would have to do to retain not only all the spending that takes place in Wales at the moment, but to actually get that net benefit we supposedly get, is to persuade the British government to give 1/5 of 1% of the money they've saved. Well, you may think we're incapable of doing that, just as some people think we're incapable of defending our employment rights and our trade union rights and our maternity rights and our national minimum wage, which we won through our own efforts. I don't share that defeatism. And I'll close by saying this. Derek did mention, and it was very helpful, Derek mentioned some of the big business corporations that support EU membership. I'm glad he did, but of course it's a much, much longer list. He could have added almost the entire membership of the Confederation of British Industry. He could have added every major bank, all the crooks, all the spivs in the City of London. He could have mentioned the Institute of Directors. The vast bulk of big business supports the EU and always has. And just because there are some marginal figures on the right who, for their own reasons, have their own arguments against the EU, the class reality of the EU is very clear. And it's no good saying, if TTIP includes this, we're going to vote against it. If TTIP includes... You don't know what it's going to include because you've been shut out of the negotiations. There's no room in negotiations for the democratically elected representatives of people. It's been negotiated by the EU Commission, largely in secret, and you haven't got a clue what that final agreement is going to come up with. You can vote against it. I hope you will. We'll work with you to try and make sure that you do vote against it. But if you think you can defeat it in the European Parliament, why do you think we're so useless here in Britain that we couldn't elect a parliament that wouldn't negotiate that kind of agreement in the first place? I don't think a Jeremy Corbyn-led government would negotiate a TTIP-type agreement. Have you given up any hope of getting a progressive Labour government in Britain? I certainly have, and I haven't. And I'll tell you what, we're more likely to get that than you'll ever get a progressive European Commission or a progressive European Central Bank.
Thank you, Rob. Steve.
Yeah, Steve Henley from the RMT. And referring firstly to our rulebook in the RMT, it's about overthrowing capitalism and putting on a socialist form of society. So that's our starting point. We hear about these people on the right, and most of them, by the way, that are mentioned, were members or mayors of the current government. So they're not some far-right friends that are out there, like the BNP, but these are mainstream politicians, by the way, that Cameron incorporated into his government, with the exception of UKIP. So that's where we're starting from, and we've researched this a little bit in the RMT. We were against going into the common market, and the reasons for that were quite simple. When you look at and it's necessary sometimes to look at the ideological reasons and the philosophical reasons why things were formed in the first place, and not just have an argument over if we're saving money, if we're losing money. But if you look into the formation of the European Union, firstly, it was a bulwark against communism. That's what they called it, a bulwark against communism. So it was there to stop communism taking over Europe as they saw it. And secondly, it was formed by 6 former empires in order to form an aggressive trading bloc to compete with other trading blocs. Now, given that its history, do you really feel that this is an organisation that's going to be on the side of the bosses or on the side of the workers? That's the fundamental question that people have to ask themselves. Now, we hear a lot about the trade union rights that the European Union have given us. Well, apart from the Working Time Directive, which is so full of holes you can drive a coach and horses through it, which still isn't applied on the railway and still isn't applied in other transport industries up and down this country, I don't see really what progressive has come out of Europe as far as trade unions are concerned. We are sitting there, and I think Rob has dealt with this very, 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 very succinctly. The rights that have been won in this country mainly come through straight trade union struggles in this country. Now, Blair boasted about having the most restrictive trade union laws, I believe, in the European Union, indeed probably the developed world. People sometimes have selective amnesia. They try to blame all this on the Tories. And we're not saying for a second that Tories didn't bring about the processes of privatisation. Of course they did. But what the European Union does is institutionalise privatisation. You cannot be a member of the European Union and have a nationalised railway. It is impossible. And that will be the same for every other public service. And don't shake your head, because I'll refer you to the 4th rail package. I'm not just interested in your opinion. If you look at the 4th rail package, it quite clearly states there that every railway in Europe has to be opened up to private competition. That's what it says. In France at the minute, you have got the situation where the freight sector in France is being opened up to private competition. National governments that have run very successful railways now have to divide that into three parts in some cases. They comply with European legislation, and all the freight sectors in Europe have to be opened up to competition. That is the reality. That is the reality of where we're coming from as rail workers. So if we had a Corbyn government getting elected tomorrow, and I'm not actually as pessimistic as these Labour MEPs, who you would have thought would be far more optimistic about the election of a government which they would belong to. I'm not that pessimistic to think that we can't get a Corbyn government that would actually say that we need nationalised industries, not just in the rail, but in the utilities, and of course protect the NHS. I think that's absolutely possible. And I'll tell you what the Remain argument is premised upon. There's only one possible outcome if we vote to come out of the European Union. That only possible outcome is a right-wing government. What absolute rubbish. What rubbish. There are several possible outcomes. One is the Tory party tears itself apart. Big business back Cameron. Even though he's lost, or they replace Cameron, you may as well have Mickey Mouse there. Whatever the facade is, big business put up their stooge, which they will support. The people that are supporting Boris Johnson go off into a rump because they actually will be in a minority when the funding is actually dished out. And the Tory party will split. That will allow the possibility of a general election, which I believe that a Corbyn party could win, a Corbyn Labour party could win. So there we would have it. But that party, if it's elected, if that Corbyn party is elected in a democratic system, albeit a bourgeois democratic system in this country, they cannot, under European regulations, renationalise the railway in its entirety. And that is a fact. That is the fact. And to me, an unelected commission in Brussels, because that's what's happening. And about this TTIP, by the way, the chief negotiator of TTIP, it's a lady, maybe you can help me out, her name's not come to mind, but she's on record as saying, well, I don't have to make this public because I'm not responsible to the people of Europe, I'm responsible to the Commission. And she's absolutely right. She's not responsible in any democratic way to the people of Europe. In the negotiations that she's actually taken place, it's responsible to the Commission. And if the Commission, where all the donkey work is done, all the negotiating is done, I find it very, very difficult to believe whatever deal that comes out of that will be turned down by the European Parliament. Because their history is they rubber stamp things. So that's what we're looking at. We're looking at the sovereignty. And let's take on this argument that was sort of thrown in by some of our adversaries. It's racist, It's racist to oppose the mass movement of people throughout Europe. These mainly white and Christian people that are going to come across Europe. It's racist to oppose that. But at the same time, it's all right. They bar all the Turks, which are slightly brown and Muslim. Everybody from Africa, everybody from India, they don't benefit from free movement. But somehow it's racist to oppose white people moving across Europe willy-nilly to reduce, and this is the boss's agenda, to reduce employment rights. And I have to say, our union have got a policy. We've always been an international union and a socialist union. We don't care who comes and works in Britain. Everybody's welcome to come and work in Britain, as far as we're concerned, as long as it's the same terms and conditions as British workers and the national agreements here. Quite simple. And we don't want to differentiate between European workers and any workers from anywhere else in the world. We're internationalists. We're not about a boss's club that gives privilege to European workers. We're totally opposed to that. And finally, I would like to say this. I suppose it comes down, we've got the TUC on the one side saying, okay, this is a fantastic thing. Well, I don't know if these people have got half an eye on lordships or ladyships or wherever they want to go. I know it's been the past of that organisation. But the very people who promoted social partnership, who promoted working hand in hand with a boss, are now the people that's saying, well, we can't have industrial struggle like the French or the Greeks or anybody else. We can't have that industrial struggle. We have to look to Europe, to some bureaucrat in Europe, to save British working people. What absolute tripe. Tell that to the Greek workers who are now saying the Syriza government is imposing more austerity than the previous Conservative government did in Greece because the European Bank threatened to pull the plug and bankrupt the company. Tell that to the Irish workers who had to go in and pay a recession tax, an absolute recession tax, when the banks went belly up in Ireland, which is imposed by the European Union to meet their criteria. And this thing about peace, we can't have peace in Europe. We can't have peace in Europe without the European Union. You know, we're not going to move geographically if we come out of the European Union. It's not that Britain's going to go off and become somewhere else. We can't have relationships with other trade unions and other peoples in Europe. We're going to come out of a trading bloc. That's all. We're just going to come out of a trading bloc. And tell the people in the former Yugoslavia about the benefits of the European Union in keeping peace. When Mr. Blair and was it Sarkozy at the time in France were quite happy to see that company ripped apart. Tell them about the benefits of peace in Europe. Tell the people in the Ukraine that socialists and trade unionists are getting attacked in the street because the Maidan backed by the European Union. The fascists are attacking socialists and banning the Communist Party over in the Ukraine. Tell them about the benefits of peace in Europe. Tell the people in the north of Ireland about the benefits of the peace in Europe. Yeah. Tell all them about the benefits of peace. What it comes down to is having the confidence to stand up to all these arguments, believe in the working class in this country. Together with the working classes in other countries, we can form alliances. But the European Union, trying to reform the European Union is like trying to feed a tiger apples and oranges in the hope that it's going to become a vegetarian. It's not built that way. It never will be built that way.
I'm Mark Reckless. I'm the UKIP Assembly member for South East Wales. Before that, I was a Member of Parliament for Rochester and Stroud, Kent. My maiden speech in Parliament, I said that I was against the European Union not because I was a nationalist, but because I'm a Democrat. And I put myself very firmly in the radical tradition of the Levellers and the Chartists. That is what I believe. That is what brought me into politics. What I don't understand is what has happened to the Labour Party that has moved away from those roots, at least in some of its manifestations, and become, at least at the, I would say at the leadership level, but I suspect Jeremy Corbyn will actually vote for leave in the privacy of the polling booth, but the parliamentary level has become a party of that European Union, of countries coming together at that elite level in a system which is fundamentally anti-democratic. Derek and Jill here are at least elected, albeit through a system of proportional representation which doesn't allow people to vote on relative candidates on those lists. But it is the EU Commission. Yeah. It's not my system. I support single transferable vote. That is, I think, the fairest and most democratic system, and that's what I'd...
Can we ask that everybody allows the speakers to make their points first? You can come in afterwards with your comments, but can we just allow everybody to make their point first? You may disagree with them very strongly, but they have a right to speak here.
Coming back to the European Commission, it is unelected. The European Union is an institution which was founded, perhaps from the best of motives by people like Monnet and Schuman, who wanted to prevent a repeat of the Second World War. I think it is best a 1940s, 50s solution to a 1940s problem, but it was founded on a fundamental anti-democratic basis, that it is the European Commission alone that has a monopoly on proposing legislation. Yes, it then comes to the European Parliament, and there are some roles for the European Parliament as against the European Council, but it's the Commission that has that monopoly on initiative within the EU system. How can that be right when those commissioners are not elected and when they meet in secret? We talk about TTIP. The reason TTIP would have this investor protection mechanism, they call it, the secret court, were a right-wing conservative government to arrange with US corporations to run part of the NHS, then if a left-wing Labour government were later to change that, those corporations could be protected by a secret court. The reason that's needed in the EU-US negotiations is because the US don't trust the courts in many of the EU countries. They don't think they will protect them or equally look at someone who's from the US as someone who's from that country. That's not the case in the UK. The Americans trust our courts as we largely trust theirs, and any deal involving trade with whatever environmental or labour protections we put into that with the United States wouldn't need one of those secret investor protection mechanisms. We hear about how Wales can't get more power if we leave the EU. Well, Wales will get more power. First, actually, we may actually have the Wales bill become an act. If we vote to remain, I think the fallout in the Conservative Party is going to be such that that bill is unlikely to make progress. If, however, we vote leave, all these powers that are currently exercised at the EU level, we begin, instead of the zero-sum game between Westminster and Cardiff, we can actually think, where is it best to have these powers exercised? Is it in Westminster or is it in Cardiff? And what's the best way of making sure those powers are exercised democratically and are open to proper scrutiny and influence by working people in this country? Thank you.
Time for the leg.